What's up, gang? Thanks for listening to the Undiplomatic Podcast, the show with undiplomatic takes about the foreign policy scene. I'm your host, Van Jackson. My guest today is an associate professor and the director of the Politics and International Affairs program at the University of the South Pacific. She's been writing prolifically about the international politics of the Pacific Islands region for some time now. She's a voice that everyone on the show needs to hear, and she has a new piece in the Lowy Interpreter called Bringing the Blue Pacific and the Indo-Pacific Narratives Together. Or I think I added a "the" there, but it's about bringing the Blue Pacific and Indo-Pacific narratives together. It's a must-read piece, short, sweet, and a great entry point into a discussion about the varied concerns and perspectives of Pacific nations and Pacific peoples. My guest is none other than Dr. Sandra Tarte. Welcome to the show. How are you doing?
Great. Thank you very much. Good to be here.
Thank you. Yes. Also, this is like the first time I've had somebody in my same time zone. So this we're breaking records. Before we get to the Lowy piece that you wrote, I wonder if you could give a big picture introduction maybe to the Pacific region, and one specific question that might be a useful starting point for that is like, how do Pacific Island nations see outside powers historically? And there may be like a big answer to that, but I'm kind of have in mind in particular like Australia, New Zealand, and the US.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So we are a region that was historically colonized by Western powers. We had obviously the Second World War interrupt that, and that's led to, I guess, in recent times, some not so close relations with Japan, but Japan has returned obviously to the region. But our relations were with Australia, New Zealand, the US, Britain, France. Most countries, since they decolonized, have maintained close relationships with their former metropolitan powers, but that kind of leads to a bit of a conflictual tendency. I mean, it's like, well, we want to keep these close ties, but we don't want to be still, under a colonial type of relationship, and there's often been tensions there, dependency issues. And in terms of regionalism, we have a regionalism that's very much been, to some extent, dependent on these former colonial powers as well, which again leads to some tensions, because regionalism is supposed to be about empowerment, about independence, about asserting our sovereignty and identity. However, we are still somehow, being managed by these outside powers. So there's tensions for sure.
Yeah. Nobody wants to be in a dependent position. Nobody wants to be managed. That actually, I had a question about the Pacific Islands Forum, the PIF. So last year there were news headlines about internal rifts that seem to have to do with like who should be the chair. And the headlines were very decontextualized. So there wasn't a lot of like scene setting or historicizing what was happening. And so I was wondering, historically, or maybe the last 30 years, how much regional cohesion is there within the Pacific? And like, what is the role of the PIF in that?
Regionalism through the PIF, for example, the Pacific Islands Forum, has been in flux for more than a decade or so. And it began largely when Fiji was suspended in 2009 from the Pacific Islands Forum due to its the political upheavals here at that time. They had the coup, and then it wasn't planning to return to a democratic government anytime soon. That triggered a period of, I think, upheaval and disruption, and countries, some of whom were not happy with this suspension, supported alternative regional forums, sub-regional forums, etc. And so you did get a splintering of regionalism at that time, and I think we've never really recovered from that, quite honestly. And there is, I think, this perception that maybe, even though the PIF is central to our regional framework, our regional architecture, it is not necessarily something we need to have. and countries opted out of the forum for a while. 5 countries removed themselves, although they resumed their membership. To me, signaling, well, maybe they don't need it. Maybe they don't see it as relevant necessarily. It's I think a bit of a it's a troubling thought maybe for those of us who've always assumed regionalism is a core part of how we do business here in the Pacific, but I don't think anything's certain anymore.
Yeah. The especially for outsiders trying to sort of get their bearings on the Pacific, do you think the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, do you think that is an appropriate comparison, or is it maybe that's how we view institutionalism or the institutional version of regionalism, but there's no consensus about it? Like, what do you think of that comparison?
There's some parallels because there's been comparisons made actually between the Pacific Islands Forum, or the South Pacific Forum as it was originally called, and ASEAN. Very, very different in a sense regional contexts, but they have this thing called the ASEAN way. We have the Pacific way. It's about doing things by consensus. It's about respecting sovereignty. It's about non-intervention, and it should also be about how the Pacific deals with its external partners and bigger powers in the region. So I think there are parallels, but obviously with the BIF, we have Australia and New Zealand in the forum as well as being our partners, which has created a kind of, it's an identity problem for us sometimes. Who are we? What do we represent? And, how do we advance the independent Pacific Island interests when you have Australia and New Zealand in the room? So, it's a problem we created for ourselves, though, at the time of the forum.
Interesting. Yeah, because Australia and New Zealand are the outsider insiders in a sense, or insider out. I don't know which one is right, but okay. The orientation that a lot of people in Washington have is, for a long time in U.S. foreign policy, the Pacific was a bit of a blind spot. And that's starting to change the last couple of years, but for reasons that are largely not good. And so I guess prior to Sino-US rivalry becoming a thing recently, return of geopolitics and all these tropes, how did Pacific Island nations view security? What were their political priorities or their public policy priorities before the geopolitical thing was like sucking up oxygen in the room? Because those priorities probably still exist.
Sure. How far back do you want me to go? We can go back to the early post-colonial era. Securing our exclusive economic zones was a number one security issue, and protecting our tuna resources from predatory powers, including the United States, which refused to recognize coastal state sovereign rights over tuna. Protecting our region from nuclear testing and nuclear militarization during the Cold War era, number one as well. These are both traditional and non-traditional security issues. And, I think we've always had that tendency to see things from a point of view of what's good for our development, but also what's good for our environment, what's good for our sovereignty and our independence. Throughout the 1990s, we started to talk more about non-traditional security, such as transnational organized crime, the usual issues that are associated with globalization. Maritime security, though, has always been very big. And from the late 90s onwards, climate change has emerged as a key issue, which in recent times has been heavily, in a sense, securitized, seen in security terms. I guess what you could say is that we have preferred to talk about non-traditional security. Pacific Island countries in their own domestic context have highlighted human security and development issues and environment issues as big, the big priorities. But we can't ignore the fact also that some countries have had very significant threats to their sort of statehood, and that includes those countries that have internal conflicts, such as Solomon Islands, Papua New Guinea, and in Fiji, the history of military coups, which reflects our own internal divisions. So security, different countries, different priorities, but there has been this tendency to say here in the Pacific, we talk about non-traditional or a broad, expanded concept of security, defining us as different from the big powers that surround us, who prefer to talk about geopolitics and the sort of more great power politics, the militarized sort of notions of security, and of course, in recent times, China threat.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the way that I've seen governments talk about security in the Pacific, or like the economic dimension of security, it hits very differently. Even what you were just saying, than the way like a lot of my counterparts in Washington think about this stuff. Like economic development as a security issue, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's not about like weaponizing economic relationships. It's more about like, if we don't have a growth path or a development path, then you can't really have security. Like some degree of like economic democracy needs to be had in order to actually have a society that's secure. Am I catching something there?
Yeah, but if I could just move beyond that and just say, I think we have a bit of a problem that security has become so broad in its sort
Mm,
of concept. Um, so broad and yet so narrow. Just for example, some countries have developed national security strategies here in the Pacific, national security plans. Um, and this is to provide a list of priorities for how they would allocate resources. Um, Samoa, for example, three key issues: uh, gender-based violence, non-communicable diseases, and cybersecurity. Those are the focus issues. That's what they want to prioritize, right?
mhm.
Um, and other countries, it is more development oriented in terms of you know resource security and so on. Um, I guess this takes me into what I was beginning to sort of think about is, even in I have my postgraduate classes, I want to talk about regional security with my students. And I began to sort of, it worried me that we were talking about so many different issues. And it was like, hang on, we used to talk about environment and climate change. Then we used to talk about as a sort of regional issue. Then we talk about marine resource management as another regional. Then we talk about security. Now security seems to be everywhere. And that troubled me a little bit because
Mhm.
we seem to be missing something here. Um, and to my mind, it was not just traditional security, but it was the sort of impact of the geopolitics that was, happening around us, and which we seem to be choosing to ignore or to, you know, see as not
Yeah.
really our business.
Yeah, I share that concern majorly. I mean, on the one hand, it's like if everything is a security issue, you've diluted the potency of what that's even supposed to mean. Like nothing is at that point. Like you're not gaining anything by treating it as a security issue. But then like I'm also on guard. I've been on guard the last couple years against there's a concept of like climate colonialism, or the treatment of the environment as a source of insecurity, particularly by like big powers in like the United
Mm,
States,
mm,
and th- leading thinking about like the way the Pentagon sort of internalized the climate crisis was to start imagining how environmental degradation leads to spaces that are insecure, that need to be patrolled, controlled, secured
mm.
physically in the traditional way with a traditional kind of like occupational mindset. um, and that's like a really perverse direction for prioritization of the climate to go. Like that's a I don't know, like not right. Yeah. And so like I sometimes I wonder, if you're going in a security direction with economic and climate issues, are you actually like undermining what it is you're trying to achieve? It's an ongoing concern. I don't know. um
Well, it also started. What also started to really bug me was that I would sit in seminars that visiting academics would give here at USP, and listen to someone tell us, well, in the Pacific, you don't talk about traditional security because the Pacific is only worried about non-traditional security. And to me, that sort of jarred as well, because yes, we might be maybe avoiding that subject in terms of the current geopolitical contests and stuff, but countries are very much worried about sovereignty. They're very much worried about, being, I suppose, about protecting their boundaries, their borders, their resources, and so traditional security is still there, but perhaps my concern was we were being branded and labeled, in a certain way, which was not helpful.
Yes, that way of treating the Pacific actually, or almost marginalizing it, it made me want to ask the question about the Blue Pacific.
Hmm.
What is the Blue Pacific narrative? What is the purpose of it?
Okay. So it goes back to the 2017. The Pacific Islands Forum kind of articulated this, which came through at the Pacific Leaders Forum meeting in Samoa. This it was an identity which was linked to a narrative, as a way of seeing ourselves and perhaps obviously presenting ourselves as a region to the outside world, not as this region of weak, helpless, small states, but as a region of very interconnected, large ocean states, which has relevance globally and collectively has some agency and ability to, in a sense, determine, the way in which we engage with the outside world and the way we others engage with us. It was about changing, I suppose, the mindset, and it was meant to also build a basis for greater cohesion as a region in terms of how we deal with certain issues and represent ourselves. So providing a basis for greater solidarity and collective action, and it caught on. It was very effective, I think, as a way of at the time countering the other narratives that were coming through, whether it was the Indo-Pacific narratives, whether it was the Belt and Road narrative from China, or whatever others were saying about the Pacific. We had our own prior, in a sense, narrative that others needed to engage with. So it is about taking some ownership of that. So in my view, it is very much a narrative. It's supposed to be a narrative of empowerment. That's my take on this. It's now been linked to a strategy, the 2050 strategy for the Blue Pacific, which is meant to guide regional action, for the next 30 odd years.
Yeah. So your Lowy Institute piece was about needing to merge the Blue Pacific narrative and the Indo-Pacific narrative. What was your motive there writing that? Like what made you write that? What was the larger point of the piece, I guess?
Well, it actually goes back to some of the things we were saying earlier about how we tend in the Pacific to say that geopolitics is it's a side issue for us. We don't really want to get caught up in the kind of geopolitical, what our former foreign minister in Fiji called. Actually, I've got his quote here. I'll point scoring. He says, actually, this is from last year. This is our former Prime Minister, Frank Bainimarama. He says, I hope that we also know that geopolitical point scoring means less than little to anyone whose community is slipping beneath the rising seas, whose job has been lost to a pandemic, or whose family is impacted by the rapid rise of commodities, and so on. This was always seen as not central to our concerns. And then what also worried me a little bit was that our development partners, and this is the Western ones in particular, the US, Australia, they were also very much getting on this bandwagon of talking about the Blue Pacific. And you mentioned the partners in the Blue Pacific. Everyone was now referring to our Blue Pacific agenda, the strategy, highlighting our issues and saying how much they would support. And to me, that was it was interesting, but it sort of raised a kind of some red flags. What was actually going on here? Because at the same time, as you know, we are seeing a very, I think, worrying trend towards much greater military, what's military tension, military positioning, and it's there's this thing happening which we seem to be taking our minds off.
Yeah.
I say, no, we want to talk about this stuff. We don't want to talk about that stuff. However, it's there. It matters. And I even went so far as to suggest that article, Van, that maybe this is a deliberate strategy. We are being sort of drawn into thinking that it's all about our Blue Pacific strategy. It's all about our Blue Pacific narrative. We are the ones who are distracted here. And we're not focusing on other things that really need to be addressed.
Yeah. I mean, the thing that I find enlightened about the Pacific's position on security, or the emphasis on non-traditional security, is not that it's like, oh, you should be doing that and not geopolitics or something. It's that there's not, I mean, this is what I made my living on, geopolitics for 20 years. Like, there's not any kind of real security to be had within that paradigm, within that idiom of geopolitics. The traditional security stuff is very much a misnomer if you have in mind security as some sense of like justice and stability and a reasonable life for people. Like, there's none of that in raw geopolitics. So if to spend all your time dwelling in that space, in that idiom, it's a trap. It makes you forsake all the things that you actually care about as a society and as a region. What I think the Blue Pacific, my sense is that the Blue Pacific narrative and the symbolism of it, or like the tokenization of it, like the fact that it's describing something that in a sentence it functions as like an object quite often. And I think that there's something that's like comprehensible or appealing about that to people who are sitting there writing speeches and talking points and strategy documents. And I suspect that has something to do with the uptake of like the White House was very responsive and like adopting gestures toward the Blue Pacific. They had this what was it, Partners in the Blue Pacific. I mean, they literally stuck it in the name of their own initiative, right? I saw some criticism about that when that came out last year, though. Do you have concerns about like the Blue Pacific narrative being co-opted?
Oh yeah, and about another layer of regionalism being imposed on us. I think this has been happening in the last 5 or so years since this, we really have seen the Pacific become more entangled in geopolitical contest. That the main Western powers are working together a lot more closely in terms of dialogues, in terms of security cooperation, in order to manage the Pacific. And the partners in the Blue Pacific may be a way, obviously, spin it positively, to coordinate better and respond better to Pacific needs and priorities. But it's also a way of, in a sense, taking the conversation away from the Pacific and managing it from that sort of level, right? And it goes against what the region's, I think, intentions are, that if we are to work together, then these discussions must be had with the Pacific, directly. So yes, there was some I think in some circles there was concern. I haven't seen this reflected in many conversations around here, though. I mean, it's not something that's been picked up so much, but Yeah.
Is AUKUS troubling for you in that sense, or was it triggering in some way
Mm.
about we're maybe we're being used the wrong way, or we're focusing our attention the wrong way, or something like that?
Yeah. There were, I don't know if you realize this, a few years ago, there were very strong reactions to Solomon Islands having a security agreement with China,
Yeah,
and what that might mean. And, there were even veiled threats made that, this shouldn't be allowed to happen. And it was quite, I felt troubling. Then we hear about AUKUS. And I think a lot of countries were thinking, wow, no consultation there. Belatedly, there was an attempt to discuss it with the forum in island countries in the Security Committee, but I think the damage had been done. And what was probably even worse was that this was about potentially, it was about Australia potentially going against the Nuclear Free Zone Treaty and acquiring its own nuclear capability, which in a region where this has been a history of, there's been a long standing
nuclear
history of
testing. Yeah,
nuclear testing, nuclear waste dumping, nuclear militarization. It didn't go down well. And, it sort of, it created quite a reaction. However, I do notice that this has become more muted as, Australia, the US, and others have tried to allay concerns with leaders and say it's not going to be a problem. We are going to take precautions and so on. But this was something that triggered my thinking on this article that, we aren't really paying enough attention. And I agree totally with former Secretary General Dame Meg Taylor on this front, that we are not, as a region, having some of these discussions amongst ourselves, and sharing information and sharing, in a sense, this is very sensitive. Obviously, countries don't often want to talk about some of these issues, but
yeah.
there are perhaps ways to do that.
Yeah. No, I'm ambivalent about AUKUS. I guess I'm sort of critical of it, but there's no the secrecy of it and the withholding it from neighbors, friends, partners until it was presented as a fait accompli. Even if you have good reason to support AUKUS, that seems like a really stupid decision, or like an irresponsible decision in a way. Um, I wanted to go back to the PIF just briefly. Like, do you think the PIF or some regional mechanism that I cannot imagine what it would be, but something regional should be a clearinghouse that outside powers have to like use in order to engage the region?
Yeah. So we have in recent times tried to strengthen security. Security cooperation has been there for a long time. We've got a security sort of strategy, sort of through the Blue Pacific. We have a few treaties and agreements, but countries have tended to also do things bilaterally, and we have countries that have different circumstances, such as the freely associated states in Micronesia, who all have compacts of free association with the US, are really bound, to the US in terms of defense and foreign policy, and they remain outside, for example, the Nuclear Free Zone Treaty, simply because they are so tied into the US. But as a clearinghouse, there are limits for the forum, but I think we are in a period now where there needs to be a way, and this is why the forum is starting to move in this direction, to have security dialogues, as there have been in other regions, where we don't necessarily have the conflicts within our region, but it's how you manage what is happening around us, and how to contain I mean, some of these issues, I didn't mention this in my article, but the China-Taiwan thing is quite a problem potentially in our region. We still have 4 countries that recognize Taiwan. For China, this is their number one priority in terms of limiting Taiwan's influence and ensuring that countries maintain this one China policy. And if there's any sign that that's being challenged, they will react. This is making it very difficult, for example, for the PIF to deal with China as a collective, right? Because there are 4 countries that deal still with Taiwan. But we need to have the discussions about, the potential, for this to really embroil our region. I mean, in Fiji, I'm concerned now that the current government is somehow giving encouragement to Taiwan that, it can assert its sovereignty and independence. And even though Fiji recognizes China, it's allowed I think through its recent initiatives it's allowed Taiwan to feel a bit more bold about what it can say. And this is only going to antagonize China. I mean, we can manage it, but I'm just concerned about the wider implications of this problem and how it intrudes into the domestic politics of countries. We've seen that happen with Solomons, for example.
Yeah, it's the outside power intersection with domestic politics that can be, I don't know, like pernicious or worrying. The thing that the Pacific enjoys that allows it to like not have to be obsessed about traditional geopolitics up to recently is that they're not enemies with each other. This isn't France, Germany, 1914. This is, it's not
ASEAN either.
That's right. Yeah. Even ASEAN countries have some like traditional security concerns with each other and territorial disputes with each other that have to be managed pretty delicately to avoid becoming militarized. And that's not something that the Pacific has. And that's a good thing. That's the model. I mean, that's what we want to replicate that in other regions,
It helps being maritime states, though, doesn't it? No land borders to worry about.
New Zealand, yeah.
Except Solomons, Papua New Guinea have had some problems during the ethnic conflict, and Papua New Guinea, big border issues with Indonesia. But that's
Yes, and that's interesting because it's like Southeast Asia, Pacific, kind of like a dividing line, and there actually is a traditional kind of clash there almost.
Especially if the border is actually West Papua, and it's a contested territory.
Yeah. On the compact states thing, I came to America through my family from the Philippines through the Pacific, and they worked on the pineapple plantations, the dole plantations in Hawaii, and that's how they came to America. And I still have family there now, actually. And why was I mentioning that? Oh, because my orientation toward the Pacific is preoccupied with the historical legacy of the United States to an extent. And like the Compact of Free Association that links Federated States of Micronesia and the Marshall Islands to the United States in this very like exclusionary way that is like not the same vibe as the rest of the Pacific, like you said, not being part of the Nuclear Free Zone Treaty, among other things. And within that context, I'm also extremely mindful of Guam and almost paying penance in a sense, because like I used to be a Pentagon strategist in a past life, and I, like literally everybody else in DC, thought of Guam in this horrific shield kind of way, where it's like it's a front line that we put there. It's almost sacrificial, to be honest. Like that's how we used to think of it. We didn't give any mind to its people its society, its culture, and the importance of like preserving that. Certainly not its self-determination. Um, and so that's a big windup, I suppose. But as a point of speculation, like, and I know there's a growing movement in Guam to realize self-determination, and like U.S. law makes that very complicated. And it's clearly a U.S. territory right now. If the people of Guam decided that they wanted to be an independent nation, I don't think the U.S. would respect that decision. But how do you think Pacific Island nations might respond to that?
Uh, well, you might have to distinguish governments and people, and
Yeah.
because the governments are more likely to take a fairly cautious line.
Mm-hmm.
um, but we have a history of support in this region for self-determination. There is strong support for West Papuan self-determination in parts of Melanesia, and for obviously Kanak self-determination in New Caledonia. I think we also through various movements have backed the Chamorro and other peoples in the region, including in Hawaii. The there is that it resonates for many, I think, in the Pacific. Yeah, maybe that's harping back to an earlier era as well, but I think definitely through certain groups, including we have the Pacific Conference of Churches, we have other regional mechanisms which link us to the North and which bring us together with all these different groups. I think there would be support, definitely, and we just perhaps need to hear that. I mean, I've been in conferences and I've heard some of the speakers from Guam on this issue, and I think this is something that would just need to be more widely available and known to the South Pacific, because we don't perhaps get enough from the North on this.
Yeah, that's fair. It's
Not
a good
many people
answer.
go to Guam from here, for example. It's
Oh, okay. In your Lowy piece, there was a point toward the end where you said, "quote It is important that there's dialogue in the region on how the friends to all, enemies to none posture can be operationalized more broadly before it is too late." Um, and it was that line that made me pull the trigger to reach out to you, actually, because the friend to all, enemy to none posture, that's also common to ASEAN, obviously, but that's common to a lot of like countries in the global South too. Like there's a large cross section of countries who are casting about for almost like a new non-aligned movement, and they don't see security in the choice of like China or the US. Like it's damned if you do, damned if you don't. And so there's got to be some kind of world making beyond this ridiculous choice. And I guess my last big question, the wind up, do you see any prospect for the Pacific to find security with other regions in Asia and South Asia, or even globally, like going beyond the Pacific and going beyond the great powers?
Yep. So firstly, that friends to all, enemies to none, or enemy to none, it's been very common throughout most of the region in their foreign policies. Perhaps obviously different things, it means different things to different countries, and how much that can be implemented. But to your question, there has been I think a trend in the last 10 or 15 years where the Pacific has sought to operate more independently, for example, at the United Nations through their Pacific Small Island Developing States Group, and outside of the Pacific Islands Forum, for example, and through various networks, established the kinds of coalitions that have been advantageous, in terms of addressing key issues globally. There are some countries in the Pacific who are formally members of the non-aligned movement, Fiji included, although the current government may not be so keen on that. Papua New Guinea and Vanuatu, the other two. But I think if we could start a conversation in the region, and this is a big if, about these issues, it may become more obvious that there are these paths, for our security, which are not necessarily about taking sides. I mean, I don't think we want to anyway. Individually, countries don't want to. Some are less free to choose than others, obviously.
Yeah.
But that's my hope, that we can start having a conversation about these issues, which haven't been on the agenda, or been seen as a distraction, or perhaps a way to leverage something. But I think we need to move beyond that now. Whether it's ASEAN or whether there are other groups that I have a graduate student at the moment who's doing a small study on this, and I think there's more work that can be done to see what other possibilities.
100%. Yeah. Well, hopefully this Lowy piece draws some attention and gets the conversation going. The piece is called "Bringing the Blue Pacific and Indo-Pacific Narratives Together." My guest was Dr. Sandra Tarte, University of the South Pacific. Thanks for coming on the show. This was awesome and very needed.